Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you. I think I'm the second speaker to wear a tie. You may have noticed that David Walker was wearing a rather nice tie. I asked him, "What is that tie?" And he said, "It's a tie of the sons of the American Revolution." And I must say, I hear a lot more about the daughters. But apparently the sons predate the daughters. Now, I wish I could tell you that this tie is a tie of the sons of the British Empire. But it's not. It's one I bought at the airport. Just because I'm British, though, you mustn't get the idea that I have anything against the American Revolution. I love this country. I love this country. I was skiing at Aspen on Saturday. I was swimming in your Gulf this morning. I was the only one swimming, but then I'm from Scotland. To me, it's warm. And I spent the whole of Sunday trying to get from one of those places to the other. Thank you, American Airlines. My legs have almost recovered. I'm going to talk about where we are in relation to the great financial crisis that we are still in. I'm afraid it's not over. We want it to be over. We wish it could just have lasted one day. But the funny thing about financial crises is that they always last a bit longer than you think. And that's because, as in most historical processes, one damn thing leads to another. Here's what happened. We had a massive collapse of international capital flows. As you can see from this first chart, they declined by a massive 82%, mainly as a result of a massive collapse of trust between financial institutions, and particularly between banks. This financial crisis caused a massive economic crisis. You can see here that global industrial production fell by more than 12% in the wake of the financial shock. What's really striking, though, when you look at what happened to the world economy, is that trade also collapsed. Just take a look at this chart, and you can see that trade fell by more than a third in the worst period of the crisis, which was late 2008, early 2009. Now, what's really startling about that is that that was a more spectacular decline than the one that happened in the Great Depression. If you had asked me this time last year, are we in a Great Depression? I would have said, on any empirical measure, yes. Compared with what happened between 1929 and 1931, we are on track to repeat history. And I was scared. You know, I'm a historian. I don't have some fancy mathematical model. I just look at what happened in the past. When I looked back at the period of the early 1930s and compared the data, not just on industrial production or trade, but also in the stock market, it looked uncannily similar. So the big question that a historian asks is, how did we avoid Great Depression 2.0? This picture here is a good reminder of what a depression is like, because it shows you a Hooverville, a shanty town in Central Park, New York City. That's how tough things got in the early 1930s. And although we certainly have tough times today, they're not as tough as that, not by a long stretch. Yes, the unemployment rate of around 10% hugely understates the real level of unemployment, but it's nowhere near where it was in the Depression. So, here's some evidence. This is the great divergence that occurred starting in June of last year. That's when I began to feel we might just be coming out of the tailspin. And you can see if you compare world industrial production, which is what this chart does, for the Depression, that's the blue line, and our crisis, that's the red line, we kind of pulled out of the tailspin. I don't know if we have any pilots here, but you'll know what it's like when you just begin to pull out of a dive. Same story for the stock market. You just compare that pink line, which is the Great Depression, and the yellow line, which is our stock market. We followed it right the way down, almost matching it perfectly until last summer. And then we pulled out of the tailspin. So the question is, how did we do that? How did we avoid Great Depression 2.0? Why is there, in fact, an audience here, an audience of people who could afford to come and waste a thoroughly pleasant afternoon listening to me? The answer is that we were saved by two dead economists. We were saved by Milton Friedman because luckily Ben Bernanke, the guy running the Federal Reserve, had studied financial history, is a specialist on the economics of the Great Depression. And shortly before the great Milton Friedman's death, Ben Bernanke said, we promise, we will not let it happen again. So when the financial crisis got really ugly, Bernanke turned on the tap and more than doubled the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. A massive injection of liquidity, the exact opposite of what the Fed did in the Depression. But we've also been trying to learn from another dead economist, John Maynard Keynes. And here you see in this chart the lesson that we learned from him. In a major crisis, Keynes said, the government should borrow. It should rely on deficits in order to stimulate the economy where the private sector is failing to stimulate it. Take a look at that number. That's the federal government deficit as a percentage of gross domestic product. In this year and the previous year, we have blown through the 10% ceiling. We have run bigger deficits on the federal budget than at any time since World War II. In fact, these deficits compare in magnitude with the deficits in the year after Pearl Harbor. We have the fiscal policy, ladies and gentlemen, of a world war without the war. Now, this is all very well as a short-term expedient. I don't disagree with Keynes that in the short term, there's much to be said for a deficit as a source of stimulus, though in my view, the monetary stimulus is more important. The problem is, and here David Walker and I speak with one voice, the problem is that this is not a Keynesian response. This is a massive structural fiscal crisis with no end in sight to the deficits. The Congressional Budget Office does these two scenarios. The extended baseline assumes that policy doesn't change, but the alternative fiscal scenario assumes that politicians will act as they normally do. Just take a look at those lines and think about what that implies. What the CBO is saying is that under no plausible scenario will there ever again be a balanced federal budget. Ever. They stopped doing the math in 2083. $1 trillion deficit a year, forever. Now that's just not credible. That just can't happen. What these scenarios are really telling you is not the future. They're telling you that something radical will have to change. And that's really the most important theme of these postprandial talks that you're hearing. You'll hear a lot in the news if you're inclined to follow financial stories about the pigs. You know about the pigs? Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain. These are the European countries with the most severe fiscal crises, the biggest deficits, the biggest problems. Greece is getting all the headlines right now because the bond market spotted that Greece had an unsustainable fiscal policy. But take a look at this table here. This tells you what the International Monetary Fund thinks are the countries with the worst fiscal problems. What it does is just to look at the adjustment they need to make in the next decade, the fiscal adjustment over 10 years to make their fiscal policies sustainable as a percentage of gross domestic product. Japan is in pole position at number 1, and I'm afraid my own country is number 2. Here come the pigs, Ireland, Spain, Greece, and in at number 6, the United States of America. Pigs are us. We can't sit complacently mocking the Greeks for their fiscal tragedy. It just hit them first. Same way that the crisis hit Bear Stearns first. Highly leveraged institutions tend to get picked off by financial markets in the order, roughly the order, of leverage. And you'll remember how the investment banks went down till there were only 2 left standing, and they could only stay standing by stopping being investment banks. I think something similar will happen to the pigs and us. After Greece, maybe Ireland, maybe Spain, and then after the pigs, probably the UK, almost certainly Japan. It'll come here too, unless we act swiftly. Let me tell you what I worry about. I don't worry about inflation. That's some way down the road. We should be so lucky that we could get higher inflation with the debt burden that we carry as a society. To have debts equivalent to more than 350% of gross domestic product is historically unprecedented for the United States. And when I say debts, I mean public plus private debt. This is the most leveraged America in American history. And the nightmare for a highly indebted society isn't inflation, it's rising real interest rates. And the trouble is that we have ample empirical evidence that once you have a significant surge in public borrowing, you will also see an upturn in long-term interest rates. And that upturn will exceed any increase in inflation, so that real interest rates will rise. And that means the real cost of servicing all the debt that the US carries, public and private, will go up. And my guess is that it could go up by as much as 2% in the relatively near future. Why do I think this? A bond market accident is coming. The reason it's coming is twofold. First, the Federal Reserve is currently committed to phasing out the support it's been given to the bond market in the form of its purchases through quantitative easing of mortgage-backed securities. That was a pretty straight swap where the Fed bought toxic assets and the people who sold them went and bought treasuries. So it was an indirect support to the market for US government debt. Not only that, but even more interestingly, our friends in Beijing, who used to borrow, or rather to finance, roughly half of our borrowing needs. At peak, actually, the Chinese were buying 75% of all new treasuries issued by the federal government, 3/4. The Chinese have reduced their commitments. They are not buying treasuries the way they used to. In fact, unless the December figures are really different, last year they probably only financed 5%, maybe less than 5%, of the federal government's borrowing needs, from 3/4 to 5%. And can you blame them? I mean, they have nearly $2 trillion worth of exposure to the federal government. Not surprisingly, they want to reduce that. Morgan Stanley issued this forecast just the other day. And what the forecast says is that, and you just need to look at the 10-year yield line, that yields will go up from where they are now, which is around 3.5% on the 10-year, to 5.5% this year. That's 200 basis points, 2 percentage points. And unless inflation does the same, which it won't, inflation will surprise, if anything, on the downside, that means nearly 2% increase in the real interest rate on all the debt out there, not just the federal debt. If the 10-year yield moves like that, so will mortgage rates. So will all rates. That has two implications. One is that the US government will spend more and more of your tax dollars and my tax dollars just paying the interest on the debt. And if the gross debt is in excess of 100% of GDP, which it will be by 2012, that is a lot of money. It could be as much as a fifth of all tax revenues just going on debt service. My former boss, Larry Summers, asked, how long can the world's biggest borrower remain the world's biggest power? The answer is 17 years. 17 years. That's when China's gross domestic product will overtake that of the United States, according to Goldman Sachs. It might be sooner than that because of the effect I'm describing, the slowing down effect that an excessive debt burden and rising real rates will have on an economy. Chinese don't have this problem. This was my favorite cartoon of last year. Chinese sub threatens the US Navy. Turn around or we sell all our T-bills. Pretty funny, except that just last week, the Chinese military explicitly suggested that this be used by the Chinese authorities as a lever to discourage the United States from making arms sales to Taiwan. This has moved from the realm of humor to the realm of policy in less than a few months. This conference is all about solutions. I have two. The first one is that we still can beat the world when it comes to technological innovation. This chart by my colleague Diego Common at Harvard Business School shows innovations and the speed with which they were adopted. This tells you at what point a particular innovation gets to be owned by a certain percentage of US households. And what this chart shows you is something really encouraging. Each new innovation is adopted more rapidly than the one before. As long as we innovate, as long as we continue to lead when it comes to new ideas, new technologies, then we can still grow our way out of the mountain of debt under which we currently labor. Innovation plus entrepreneurship. That's the magic combination that made the United States the biggest economy in the world. And it's not clear to me yet that the Chinese can imitate us in either respect, in innovation or in entrepreneurship. But if we do not initiate root and branch fiscal reform soon, we will cut off the lifeblood to both innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to simplify the income tax code, radically simplify it, and create a single low rate. Get rid of the poverty traps. Increase the incentives. We need to reduce the corporation tax. We need to make ourselves competitive there too. We need to compensate for these reforms by creating either a federal value-added tax or a federal sales tax, preferably something that taxes consumption and encourages thrift. And we need to reform Medicare and Social Security before, ladies and gentlemen, they bankrupt America. My payoff line is simple. Without fiscal reform, there can be no sustainable recovery. Thank you very much indeed.